Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Get ready to expand your intuition, connect to God, experience deeper relationships, open your heart and feel more joy, and finally end the chaos in your life. Are you ready to get unstuck and more? You ask, how do I do it? The answer is simple. The time has come for peak spiritual fitness. It starts right now on Spirituality Bootcamp with your host, Kristen White.
Welcome everyone, and I'm your host, Kristen White. And I was just sitting there listening to the opening, and I was thinking back over the past 6 weeks that we've been spending on this series, Spirituality Bootcamp, the 7 principles of spiritual practice. And this is the last night in the series, and we're going to be covering prayer, which is really, I believe, the gateway to all possibilities, because it's that conversation that we have with the divine within us, and ultimately that conversation with God. And I was listening to the opening of the show about peak spiritual fitness. And what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to have peak spiritual fitness? So as we're thinking about that and exploring that and developing what it means to be really fit in our lives, when I think about fitness, I imagine, if I were to go to the gym and I was out of shape, and I do like to go to the gym, but if I were to go to the gym to get myself fit spiritually, I wouldn't just show up one time and, go through a round of weights and say, all right, I'm ready, I'm in peak spiritual fitness. No, what I would do is I would work with a trainer. I would set a daily schedule, and I would show up at a time and make a commitment to the discipline of working on my body. Okay, so that's what we're doing here with Spirituality Bootcamp. We're making a commitment to working on not only our mind, our body, and our spirit, but a commitment to the practice of active participation in getting to know ourselves within on a much deeper level. And that's really what this whole series is about. I created this series actually quite a while ago. It came out of my own spiritual practice, and I thought, well, there's these certain principles that I'm using every single day, and I have 3 children, and I'd set my alarm and get up really early in the morning, and I would go in and do my meditation in my sacred space, and I'd practice gratitude and forgiveness and visualization and affirmation, and ultimately, throughout the entire day, I would be in a state of prayer. And our guest today, and I'm so excited about her, and I'm going to bring her on in just a minute, we're going to talk about that prayer is not what you think it is. It's not what we've been taught to believe that it is, where we just show up in a church and we read some words and then that's it. It's about being in a state of connected reflection. And, so I came up with this series, Spirituality Bootcamp, and I was talking to Shane Travis, and we co-created VividLife University because we wanted all of you who've been listening to VividLife, thousands and thousands of listeners. VividLife was just voted the best of Blog Talk Radio. This is out of millions and millions of shows. And we put our heads together. I'm the first host on VividLife Radio. We thought, well, what can we do to really teach our listeners and to show and to give practical step-by-step examples with some of the foremost spiritual teachers and leaders on the planet. And that's how Spirituality Bootcamp came to be this summer. So I just, as we're moving into the last show, before we even get started, I just want to thank all of you, every single one of you, for committing to the practice and for showing up and participating in Spirituality Bootcamp. We've gotten tons of emails and a wonderful response, and then the 7 teachers have just been amazing. So if you've missed a part of the series, as a gift to you, we are going to be playing a back-to-back encore coming up in the next week or so, and then we will run this series again. And if you want to register to find out about that, or if you missed part of it, or you want to refer it to a friend, you can go to vividlife.me, and right there on the front page of that website, you can register and you will have access to the encore recordings and ultimately the wonderful advanced classes that are available through all of the teachers. So lots more of information about that, and we will also have a new season of Spirituality Bootcamp coming up in October. So just a couple of announcements, and also just wanting so deeply to extend to you my gratitude and my blessings to you for being part of this series, Spirituality Bootcamp, the 7 Principles of Spiritual Practice. And again, I'm your host, Kristen White, and tonight our guest, and she's amazing. We were just chatting before we came on the show, but her name is Edie Weinstein, and she has, had a journey in her life. She became a widow 14 years ago, and, we were talking before the show, and she said, it was faith, family, and her friends that helped her overcome this incredible tragedy. And I know that some of you listening, have lost loved ones and come back from spaces that are so dark you didn't think the light would ever shine in there again. And Edie Weinstein is, she's known as the Bliss Mistress, and I love that. She's just a really dynamic motivational speaker. She is a transformational writer, an interfaith minister, and she's spent her entire life's career as a social worker. I mean, this is someone who's clearly on a path of service. And just recently she said, I'm devoting all of it, all my time, all my energy to 100% being in this space as a spiritual teacher, a transformational thought leader. And she has a book called The Bliss Mistress Guide to Transforming the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. So, Edie Weinstein, welcome to Spirituality Bootcamp.
Thrilled to be here. Really excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. Tonight we're talking about prayer, okay? And I'd like to just start out, how do you, Edie, define prayer?
Well, when I thought about being on the show tonight, the first thing that came to mind was to share the first prayer I ever heard growing up. I was raised Jewish, so the Shema, S-H-E-M-A, is the signature prayer in Judaism, which is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And the traditional translation is hear, listen, hear, O Israel, meaning the people of Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But my favorite translation of it is that which we call God is oneness itself. And I heard that translation many years ago when another spiritual teacher who some of your listeners may be familiar with, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, was my rabbi when I lived in Florida. That was his translation. And that resonates so clearly for me with what spirituality and prayer is about, that whatever we call God is just oneness. So prayer, for me, is being in the acknowledgement that we are all one, that there's no separation between us and a divine entity. So that's how I would define it.
Yeah, I love that definition about oneness. And I will tell you that, I also had a dark period in my life where I think that, I don't know what it is, it's almost like we signed this agreement, okay, I'm going to allow everything to fall apart so that it can come back together. But the beautiful gift of being in that moment is sometimes we find ourselves having these amazing conversations inside prayer. And it's not, it may start out as like a negotiation, okay, God, if you just take care of this one thing, I promise that I will, never do whatever it is you feel like your bad habits are again. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, Edie, that 911 call to heaven. And that's not the kind of prayer that we're really talking about here today.
No, I don't. I used to negotiate with God that because I grew up in a tradition where God was seen as an outside male entity, and for me, it was an evolution to be able to see God as an energy. So I don't ask God for anything. What I do is say thank you for all of these blessings and acknowledging that it already exists, because my experience is that everything that is now in existence was once a thought in someone's mind. And whether it's the computer, the phone, you, me, everybody who's listening was once a thought. And I visualize whatever it is that I'm wanting to draw into my life and expressing gratitude that it's already there somewhere. So I certainly have had experiences like everyone where things haven't gone the way that I've wanted them to. You mentioned early in the call about being widowed at 14 years ago. I was 40 years old, and my husband Michael had died of hepatitis C. He was in the ICU for 5.5 weeks, which was 40 days. So I thought about 40 days and 40 nights. I called it my biblical travail when I was he was in the ER, in the ICU. And I literally lived there with him. And I would have what I called God wrestling sessions, where I would say to the God of my understanding, he's mine and you can't have him. And God would say, he's mine and he's on loan to you like everyone else in your life. So I understood that everybody that I now know and love will one day die or leave me, or I will die or leave them. And that's why I treasure my time with them. So in those inevitable dark nights of the soul, I was able to say, okay, there's something that I'm learning from this. That was probably one of the most, up until that point, profound spiritual experiences in my life, was trying to negotiate for Michael's life. And I realized that he had signed, I think you and I had spoken earlier about, or maybe even this conversation just now, about signing up for this, that I think he only signed up for 48 years, and his work was done. And mine was just beginning.
I think that, I know that it is an amazing gift of clarity sometimes that comes out of these moments of just, complete darkness. And it sounds like that not only did you have the gift and the understanding about that sometimes in life, we share that journey with other people, and other times we end up going on alone without them. Mm-hmm. And that when we come from that space and we understand that, and then we develop deeper within ourselves as a result, we may not feel like it's a gift at the time, but in fact it becomes such a powerful seed of transformation. Like, I'm sure that you are not the same person now that you would have been if you hadn't had some of these experiences that you spent the 40 days in that darkness.
Yeah, I absolutely know that I'm not in so many ways. And even while I was experiencing it, it was surrealistic. I was thinking, this is my life, living in a hospital, losing my husband, being, after he died, I turned my life around completely. And literally, I heard what I called the voice speak to me when Michael died. The same voice that said, no, he's mine and he's on loan to you. Now, having been a psychiatric social worker for a lot of years, I know the difference between spiritual guidance, divine guidance, and psychotic voices. This clearly was a message from whatever, from the beyond, if you want to call it that. And literally, when we turned off life support, the voice said, call the seminary and ask to finish what Michael started. And I knew exactly what that meant, because he had been enrolled in the new seminary, which is a school in New York, to become an interfaith minister. And he had completed the first of a 2-year course of study, and I casually studied along with him. I read to him when he couldn't concentrate to read. I would type his papers for him because he had peripheral neuropathy and he couldn't always feel his fingers. I watched the videotapes because he was a correspondence student. So I was unwittingly preparing myself to do this. So a few days after his funeral, now he died December 21st of 98. His funeral was Christmas Eve morning of that, a few days later. That January, I started at the seminary. And when I spoke with the dean, Diane Burke, she said, you're welcome to join us on 2 conditions. One is that you're doing this for yourself and not just for Michael. And the other is that you can complete the 2-year course of study back-to-back and graduate with his class, or you can wait till the next year and graduate. I did 2 years' worth of study in 5 months because I had been preparing for it, or God had been preparing me for it. And I got ordained that June. So that was a big change, becoming a minister. A nice Jewish girl becoming an interfaith minister just wasn't part of my conscious plan, but clearly it was part of the universe's plan.
Yeah, I love that, how it's like we have our plan and then there's divine plan.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, the show today. We're talking about prayer. And, we've talked about the negotiating prayer and determined that is not what we're really talking about today. But What is the role that you feel that prayer plays in your life now today?
Mm-hmm. Prayer is not something that's relegated to a particular time or place. It's all the time. I'm praying constantly because our thoughts, our intentions are prayers. What we put out into the world, conscious or unconscious, is a prayer. I forget when it was. Back in November, I was at the Celebrate Your Life conference in Phoenix, and Wayne Dyer was speaking. And he's just an amazing, for those of you that are familiar with him, and those that aren't, an amazing proponent of conscious prayer. And he used the two words, I am. And we hear that all the time, that God referred to itself when Moses was up on the mountain. Who should I say sent me? And God said, tell them I am sent me. But we use the words I am all the time. And when we say I am tired, I am poor, I am sick, the universe says, yep, you're right. When we say I am prosperous, I am healthy, I am successful, I am loving, the universe says, yep, you're right. So that to me is a prayer. I'm asked often to pray for people. I call this Prayer Central. Oftentimes people will say, will you put me in your prayer circle or your prayer chain? And I put it up all the time. Sort of like, the movie Bruce Almighty. Do you remember when, that scene where he had all the Post-its all over his room and then he's sort of putting them on the computer? Well, I feel like my computer is like that. It's Prayer Central. And when I pray, when I'm asked to pray, I don't pray that somebody overcomes sickness. I pray that they acknowledge, that they accept the highest good. I always say, I see you healed, whole, and healthy. And I think that's one of the greatest prayers we can offer somebody, is seeing them in their divine form.
Well, it's interesting, Edie, what you're saying, because, we also talked about this, and I believe that as souls, we are always in a state of perfection, and that sometimes our physical selves forget that. Like we almost go into the illusion that things are not right. And so what you're saying makes perfect sense, that we need to just acknowledge and remember and reconnect to that state of perfection that already exists. Mm-hmm. And that it's almost like really what we're asking for is to clear away the illusion, in fact, that there is anything wrong. Because in truth, nothing is. Everything is divine. Everything is in order. Everything is we're using the word perfection, but in its optimum state of expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see that, and I forget. I call it spiritual amnesia, that I forget that things really are okay. When I look back on 14 years ago, and we're coming up in November. Michael went into the hospital November 11th, died December 21st. As I look back on that, it feels like somebody else's life, and I think, look what I made it through, and look what everybody who's lost a loved one has made it through. Look at the what we call tragedies that people have experienced. I remember years ago talking to a friend whose son was killed by a drunk driver. His son Ben was walking home from a party. He was 16 years old, and he wasn't drinking, but somebody who hit him was. And I asked my friend Barry, I said, how do you deal with that? How do you come to terms with that? And he said, I can't help but think that Ben couldn't have been any other place than where he was, or nothing would make sense to me. He said, I can't see it as random. And, it was almost like a soul contract. And I look at the experiences in my life, the losses, the challenges. In 1992 was when Michael was diagnosed with hepatitis C. It was the same year I had an ectopic pregnancy, and the same year we lost our home to Hurricane Andrew when we lived in Homestead, Florida. And faith, family, and friends got us through that year too. My parents have both died. My dad died in 2008. My mom died in 2010. And those were deeply spiritual experiences. They are very present in my life. They're very much with me. And one of the things that I've written about in my book was the last two chapters were about the hospice journey I took with my mother. And prayer played a huge part in that, because we would talk about death. We would talk about her feelings, her fears. And I remember asking her when she was first diagnosed and first went into hospice, Mom, what do you think happens when you die? And she says, I don't know. And I thought she believed in an afterlife, because my mother had a very strong spiritual faith. But she said, I don't know. But I said, well, when you do know, come back and tell me. And she said, I'll come back as a butterfly. And there have been so many butterflies that have shown up in my life in totally unexpected ways. And that, to me, is, that's prayer. Is whenever I see a butterfly, it's a connection with my mother. And it's not that I'm praying to her, but praying with her.
What a beautiful image, Edie. I want to thank you so much for sharing, because I know that these are painful experiences that happened in your life, and I know that many of our listeners have been through this space. What we're talking about tonight is prayer, and my guest is Edie Weinstein, and she is the author of the book, The Bliss Mistress Guide to Transforming the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. And, as we're sitting here talking about prayer, I can't help but wonder, Edie, there's so many different spiritual traditions. There's Judaism, there's Christianity, there's, I've studied with a Tibetan monk, there's Buddhism. It just goes on and on and on. And, what I believe inside my practice is this whole concept of spiritual integration, that we're all in some way having the same conversation, even though the language or the expression of that conversation may look different. It's still the same. It's about oneness and connection. Can you speak to us about prayer either inside different cultures or different traditions, and are these prayers all equally as powerful?
Well, I got goosebumps when you asked that question about equally as powerful, and goosebumps are my truth barometer. I grew up in a tradition that had, the Judeo-Christian tradition, that had a particular mindset. At their core, I believe that all religions are about unity, and any misuse of that is kind of veering from the main course of the tradition. So if you look at a lot of the prayers, they're all about connection with the divine. They're all about love. They're all about unity. When I went to seminary, we learned about cross-section of different traditions, everything from, again, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. We learned about earth traditions, Wicca, everything equally valid. And I don't think anybody has more of a direct line to God than anybody else. What I say is that love is my religion and God's too big to put in a box. So I love the 12-step concept of the God of our understanding, and that's constantly evolving. So I think that there isn't any one traditional prayer that's any more powerful than anything else. But the one thing that I remember hearing, and I don't recall who said this, is that thank you is probably the most powerful prayer that there is, expression of gratitude. So when we're praying, when you look at people that pray for their sports team to win, I don't think God picks sides any more than God picks sides in a war. So I really don't know how to answer that one except to say that we all have a direct line to God, and that's our hearts. That's our grateful hearts.
I have heard, and I find this to be true myself, that it is the same expression of prayer whether we memorize and recite a prayer or we read a prayer. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, I remember years ago hearing the story about a child that was just reciting their alphabet, and the mother or father came in and said, "What are you doing?" And the child said, "I'm praying." And he said, "But you're just reciting the alphabet." "Yeah, I'm just tossing out the letters and let God decide how to put them together."
That's a great story.
Everybody prays in a different way. My father was a very observant man. He was raised Orthodox Jewish, but in our home we went to a conservative synagogue, not political conservative, but in terms of Jewish practice, it's Orthodox, conservative, Reform. So we're kind of the middle ground. And my father would read the Bible to himself every night and every morning, and he would go to synagogue. But for him, his Judaism was more than just words in a book. He lived it. He practiced it. He volunteered. Whenever somebody at the synagogue needed a minyan, which is a quorum of 10, back then it was 10 men, now it's 10 men or women, he was there. So for him, his prayer was more than just words in a book. His was prayer in action. And my parents were both very active volunteers. So for me, volunteering is prayer in action. For some people, dancing is prayer. For me, it is. I love dancing. Drumming for me is prayer. Yoga is prayer. Being of service is prayer. So any loving act, any way that connects us one to the other, for me is prayer.
I love a lot of the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda from the Self-Realization Fellowship. And I remember when I was doing a lot of meditation work early on, he had inside, this is a teeny little book, and it's funny because my kids would come in and they'd see his picture on the cover, and they're like, who is that guy? He passed away in the 50s. He's got long hair, and he is from India. And he talks a lot about the Christ consciousness, but his writings are really in a form of poetry. Thou art the ocean, I am the wave, we are one. It's these beautiful, poetic imagery. And I found that, at least for myself, that having these thoughts, these high vibration verses, that could kind of just absorb in, that it was very soothing. And so as I would go through my day, so I'd start out with, my spiritual practice, which is what we're talking about in the boot camp. But then as I'd go throughout the day, I would find that the poetry would float back in, whether I was driving carpool or, things would come up. I'd think about one of the phrases, and it was like giving myself a hug or an embrace around my soul, just the beauty of the words.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Yogananda. I have dear friends that are students of his, and they have a special meditation room set up with pictures of him everywhere, and another friend of theirs as well. And these are not cosmic foo-foo people. They're very grounded people for whom their spirituality is an everyday practice. So I've read a little bit. I'm not as connected to his words as they are to his teachings, but I've seen the difference that spiritual teaching has made in their lives. And they are all three of them do service work in the world as well. And what you were describing reminds me very much of the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz, which I consider prayers as well. You're familiar with their work?
Yes, I am. It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're I really call them love poems to God. They're multi-layered, so they can be very sensual poems from one human being to another, but they're also very ecstatic love poems to God.
It's interesting because also, and I know we're talking about different cultures and traditions and people throughout history. Also, Teresa de Avila, who was a nun, she used to have an ongoing conversation with God. And I know that some of her writings as well are just absolutely beautiful. And I like them because they're examples of, like what you've talked about, of that conversation that comes from your soul, to connect, to acknowledge, to bring forth like a brighter light, I believe, that's from within ourselves. Can you talk to us a little bit about the combination of prayer and intention, and then moving that forward to like a healing force within us?
Yeah, I set an intention every morning. It's a conscious awareness, that I made it through the night. Not that I was afraid I was going to die in the middle of the night, but gratitude for being able to live another day. And I set an intention, which I consider a prayer, and it's always the same one. It's to have extraordinary experiences and connect with amazing people. And every day I do, whether it's people like you who, that I've not met face-to-face, people that I connect with via Facebook. My son calls me a Facebook addict, but I'm on it for a lot of reasons. And one of them is to connect with kindred spirits. And people show up in my life by divine invitation. And I ask myself this all the time: why should it surprise me when I issue an invitation to the universe for an experience that it shows up? Or why should it surprise me that I show up in somebody else's life when they've invited me, unbeknownst to me, that they're inviting me into their lives? So that's my intention. And throughout the day, it's almost like a reset button. If things start feeling out of whack for me, I'll remember my original intention, and I'll ask to be redirected. It's sort of like, I think I've heard that when pilots fly airplanes, that they're off course 99% of the time, and they have to do a course correction to bring themselves back in alignment. When I face life challenges, I do that. I ask for that course correction. And in those inevitable dark nights of the soul, I have what I call, my inner Annie comes out, and, she'll sing, the sun will come out tomorrow. And I'll remember that the sun always comes out, and that I'm always taken care of. And God, Goddess, all that is how I refer to it. It's got my back, no matter what. And you and I and everybody listening on this call and everybody on the planet that's alive has survived everything that has ever happened to us, or we wouldn't be here. And what makes us think we're not going to get through this one? So that reminds me as well that that everything always works out, even the painful things, even the losses, even the challenges. They're there to kind of sharpen our pencils and to help keep us on target. And gratitude. Gratitude is a huge, I think I mentioned that, is a huge prayer. That I do my best to express gratitude even for the sucky stuff, because it's there for a purpose. It's like exercise equipment that makes us stronger spiritually. And that fits in perfectly with the concept of spirituality boot camp. I've got my spiritual muscles are pretty well toned about now.
You've been working out.
Yeah.
You touched on such a great point earlier, and about how, when we send out an invitation, that we're almost surprised that someone shows up at our party. And I, a while back, I call that the angelic dating service. So it's like we sit there, we're like, oh, this is what I'm looking for. And then all of a sudden it seems like it's magic that will show up in my life. But what it really is about is I believe that when we use these spiritual practices, these principles, prayer, gratitude, forgiveness, it creates around us a certain vibrational credibility, where we have we're in alignment. So what we feel inside, what we express on the outside, what we see manifested in front of us by the people around us, it's all in alignment. And so the angels, our guides, our departed loved ones, non-physical entities, whatever we want to call them, we're not alone on this journey. We're surrounded at all times by, I think, a team. Who knows how large that team is, that soul group. And they're always out there, working on our behalf to bring opportunities for our growth, for our expansion, for our awareness. And so what I think that prayer is that ultimate connection point that, it's like you talked about the pilot. Okay, and the pilot's always course correcting. Well, the prayer is the connection from the cockpit to the tower. So it's like, just in case we need to know how we're off track, or that we need a course correction, or we need a transmission to kind of tell us how we're doing, that's what prayer is. It's the circuit. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. And we're never, I don't think God ever goes away. Like people say they need to find God. I don't think God is lost. I think we sometimes get lost in our fear thoughts, in our, the monkey mind that tells us that we're separate. I don't think God's gone anywhere. So it's, for me, about conscious connection with that source, with that energy, whether you call it God, Goddess, whether you call it divine, whatever. One of the things that years ago, roll back a little bit, I believe in messages, things happening for a reason, messages from the beyond. A few years ago in meditation, I heard the words by divine design. And I said, what's that mean? And God said, you'll know. Well, that's what I call my business now, because I believe that things happen by divine design, that there's a purpose for it. I had an experience a few weeks ago when I went to the bank, and I'm standing in line, and there's somebody behind me, and the manager comes out. I'm assuming it's the manager because she came out of the biggest office, and she's holding 2 candy bars in her hand, and she said to each of us, would you like, $100,000, whatever, $100,000, and she meant the candy bar. And I said, well, I'll take the money and the candy bar, thank you. And we start talking, and I'm telling her about my business and about my book, and I told her my name, and she gets this shocked, surprised grin look on her face, and she asked me to come into her office. So we're sitting down, and she said, I have to tell you something. I believe in messages. And she said she was born February 4th. Her father was born February 5th. Her grandmother was born February 6th. And they've both since died, her father and her grandmother. And she said she was in conversation with her deceased father the week prior, and said, I hear from you a lot, but how come I never hear from Nana? And he said, well, you'll get a message from her very soon. So she's sitting opposite her desk, and she said, you're the message. She said, guess what my grandmother's name was?
Edie Weinstein.
Well, not the Weinstein part, but Edie. Her name was Edie.
Yeah.
And it's such a rare name. I haven't met more than a half a dozen Edies in my life. And she said, you came to me. My grandmother sent you. And she said, my grandmother's favorite color was purple, and you're wearing purple pants. And I noticed that right away. So she issued an invitation, and I showed up. Now, this was a bank that I don't know, a branch that I don't normally go to for my banking business. And it was at a time that I don't normally go to a bank because normally I was in my full-time job. And this woman happened to be there. So one of my spiritual questions that I don't know if I'll ever have an answer to is, do things happen at random, or are they meant to be? The Hebrew word is beshert, that either a person or an experience is meant to be. How do I know that this woman and I didn't sign a soul contract eons ago to show up at the same place at the same time for us to have this interaction? How do I know that Michael and I didn't show up for us to have this interaction, for us to create a magazine that we published for 10 years that put me in touch with a lot of amazing spiritual teachers? How do I know that didn't happen by divine design? How do I know that you and I didn't contract for this eons ago? I don't know.
And, of course, my response is, of course we did.
Yeah. Like when people say, what are the chances that this could happen? I say, only 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
There's 100% chance.
Hello, everyone. And, tonight we're talking about prayer here on Spirituality Bootcamp. And I was just speaking with Edie, and I really feel like it would be such a wonderful experience for all of us to share in a prayer together. There is a lot of power when two or more people come together and pray, and that the community that is formed as a result of that. So, the VividLife community is thousands upon thousands of people. And so know that in this moment, as we share this prayer with Edie Weinstein, who is an interfaith minister, that it is reverberating around the planet. So, Edie, would you love to lead us in a prayer?
Sure. Well, this is going to be a little unusual. I'm going to ask as we do this. It's called These Hands, and it was something that I was asked to write several years ago by a friend who was going to be writing a book with the description she never published. So I'm going to read some of the little blurbs from it, but I'm going to ask as we do this that you hold your hands out, whether or not you have, I'm a Reiki practitioner, so whether or not you do any kind of healing work, hold your hands out as if you're sending energy from your heart and your hands out all the way around the planet. You can even imagine holding a miniature version of the planet in your hands. And maybe some of the lines that I read will resonate with you, and if they don't, think of your own hands, because this is a prayer where you're offering your heart, your love through your hands. So the first one was an experience that I had. And these hands held a tiny baby bird and ferried it from a windowsill at Blockbuster Video into a tree across a parking lot so it could await the return of its family. I was assured by a woman who works at a bird sanctuary that opposed a legend, mama birds do not reject their young if humans have touched them. So if you've ever held a tiny baby bird or a tiny animal in your hands, send that image your love. These hands stroke wrinkled brows as transition neared from one form of life to another when I was a nursing home social worker. If your hands have ever stroked the wrinkled brows of an elder as they've passed from this life to the next, envision that. These hands dig deeply into the earth, planting seeds that blossomed into exquisitely beautiful flowers. If your hands have ever dug into the earth, planting seeds, imagine that. These hands tap on computer keyboards, expressing God language in poetry and prose. If your hands have ever created beautiful word pictures or beautiful images through art, imagine that. These hands celebrate joyously as they clap to acknowledge inspired performances by artists, musicians, speakers, dancers, and actors. If your hands have ever applauded the beautiful God-inspired work of those types of people, imagine that. These hands held those of my husband for 5.5 weeks while he was in a coma and grasped them tightly and then gently released them when he made his journey into the light. For anyone there who's ever lost a loved one and has been able to midwife them into their next life, imagine your hands doing that. These hands comfort mourning friends and family at the death of loved ones. If you've ever been there to support others when loved ones of theirs have died, then let your hands do that. The last one I want to offer is these hands are connected to my heart. Know that yours are as well, and that they have power beyond your wildest imagining. So use your heart, your hands, your mind to heal this beautiful planet of ours and to heal yourself. So I'm going to ask you now to place your hands on your heart and feel the love that you are. Know that you are love incarnate, that that's what you came here to be, that's what you came here to teach. And so it is.
And so it is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Edie. That was beautiful. You know, it is so powerful, and I felt that energy coming through my hands as you were talking. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, we were talking about all the different traditions and all the different cultures. And one thing I think that really stays constant is the symbols and the imagery. You know, so everyone of every culture who's on this planet, you know, has hands, and they've cared for others with those hands. They've worked to create a better community, to care for their family, to comfort, you know, a sick child or an aging parent. And what a great image. I think that that is a perfect example of, like, transcending, you know, what all of us have been taught is, you know, one kind of prayer or another. And I love this expanded definition of prayer that you've created.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about, you know, we were just talking about these movements. You know, there was some movement inside this prayer. Are there any other rituals that you can advise that, you know, go along well with prayer?
Oh, absolutely. Being in nature. Nature is, for a lot of people, their church, their synagogue, their mosque, their temple. There's nothing contrived about it. So if you can be in nature, if you can just sit in silence and listen to the sound of the wind, if you can walk barefoot on the earth, if you can immerse yourself in water. Last weekend, I was tubing down the Delaware River with my friend Andrea, and for me that was a prayer because the water was carrying us from one destination upriver to 3 miles downriver. And we were just observing everything, the clouds, the birds. There were herons escorting us down the river, watching the water, watching the rocks. That was a prayer. Dancing, for me, as I mentioned earlier, is a prayer. Being danced by God, I guess, is one way to look at it. Drumming, because drumming to me is incredibly meditative. And it's also a unifying experience. If anyone here has ever been to a drum circle, you know that there's such power in drumming as a community. We didn't talk about this, but intentional prayer for someone's healing making such a huge difference. Praying for someone's safety. Oh, this came to mind. You might be familiar with this story. Greg Braden tells a story about praying rain. Have you ever heard that story?
You know, I've had him on my show, I think, about 3 or 4 times, but I don't know if I've heard this one.
Well, this one it's real quick because it's more than just about, it's not about praying for something. He tells a story, now I may not have the exact story correct, but a friend of his was a shaman or a medicine man in a Native American tribe, either in Arizona or New Mexico. And this was years ago. They had a drought. So Greg was visiting him, and the man asked him, you want to come with me while I pray rain? And he said, you mean pray for rain? He said, no, not pray for rain, pray rain, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So he goes up to where there's like a plateau, and the man takes off his shoes, steps into a circle, closes his eyes, and lifts his head, takes a few breaths, and about 5 minutes later, he says, okay, we're done. Let's go get something to eat. He said, what are you talking about? What do you mean you're done? And he said, I thought you were going to pray for rain. He said, no. I said, pray rain. What I did is that I envisioned rain, because if I pray for rain, it's acknowledging that it doesn't exist, that it's not there. So I prayed rain. I visualized it. I imagined it falling from the sky. I imagined feeling it on my skin. And that's all I needed to do. So within a day or so, it torrentially rained for something like 3 or 4 days in a row. And Greg had contacted his friend. He says, okay, now what? He says, something like, I knew how to start it. I just don't know how to stop it. So what I do is that I pray rain for people. I pray that I pray their wellness. I don't pray for their wellness. I also know, as you mentioned, we have guardian angels. My sister was in a very serious car accident on Friday night, and she walked away from it with minor injuries. Her car was just smushed, and she had a guardian. She had an angel pendant, on her rearview mirror, and she swears that my parents helped protect her. And then a friend of hers named Leah, who just died about a week or so earlier, she heard Leah's voice telling her to stay calm, that everything was going to be all right. And my sister is a pretty mainstream, grounded person. She's not a woo-woo person like me. So for her to acknowledge that was really pretty powerful. So, we were grateful, obviously, that she's okay. I mean, she had some injuries, but it could have been a whole lot worse.
Edie, I do a lot of medium work, and I just got a full body chill as you were telling that story. So I call that the chill of confirmation. So I do believe that your sister is, in fact, sharing truth with all of us.
Yeah.
And you're talking about something that I wanted to make sure that we touched on is, a lot of people think of when they think about prayers, they think about miracles. I mean, what other miracles have you seen either in your work or in other people's lives as a result of prayer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen people heal from illnesses. I've seen money show up totally unexpectedly. I had an experience in 2009 where, and I wouldn't have called it praying for something, but being in that consciousness, in that miracle, and I call it manna, M-A-N-N-A, manifestation, like manna from heaven, consciousness. Michael Beckwith had come into Philadelphia with his wife, Ricky, and they were doing a presentation for an interfaith community that I'm part of, and I was what I call a PR goddess. I helped with the PR and media for it. And on the way into the event, I parked my car a few blocks away. And in our family, we have what we call Uncle Jimmy parking spots. My mother's brother Jim would always find the perfect parking spot wherever he went. So I invoked the spirit of Uncle Jimmy, and I said, okay, please find me the perfect parking spot. Well, this was like 5 or 6 blocks away, which wasn't a big deal. When I got out of the car, there was a penny next to the car, and I let it sit there. When I got back at the end of the night, after being immersed, now, I don't know, have you ever been in their presence, Michael and Ricky Beckwith?
I have not seen them in person, no.
They are absolutely amazingly, I call them a spiritual power couple, with very rich energy, and no pun intended. When I got back to the car, I say that the penny invited a very good friend. There was a $20 bill next to my car. And I thought, okay, candid camera, is somebody trying to rob me? Nobody was around. So, I didn't ask for $20. I didn't ask for money. I didn't, but it was almost like a reward, like, okay, good job, good girl.
Yeah, you amped up your your bank of good karma.
I did, obviously I did. But I've had that happen where I've shown up at the right place at the right time and that's my affirmation too. I'm always at the right place at the right time. And when I'm in that awareness, miracles happen all the time. The mom miracles. The butterflies showing up, the people that show up in my life. I don't think anything isn't a miracle.
Right. I think that's really the great way to look at it, is that, everything that happens in its own way is, in fact, a miracle. And believe it or not, we're almost at the end of our show, and as part of this series, Spirituality Bootcamp, these conversations that I'm having with all these different spiritual teachers are just amazing. And what we're hearing from the listeners is, I want more. I want to go deeper. I want to get into this energy and really absorb it like a sponge. And so as a result of that, we've created a series of, we call them advanced classes, but you don't have to be advanced. It's just more content about this topic. So I know that you're offering something, Edie, to everyone. Can you share with us a little bit about what your class will be covering?
Yeah, and mine is coming up in December, so we've got several months to prepare for that. But what I'm going to be doing is kind of a broad brush overview of prayer in different cultures and different traditions, how different types of prayers work for people. Because we're coming up to the holidays, in December we've got Christmas, we've got Hanukkah, we've got the winter solstice, and how all of those holidays are linked together. They're all about light, about the miracle of light. So we'll be talking a bit about that. We'll be talking about how prayer works, mechanically, I guess, what the mechanics of prayer are, how they can change people's lives, whether or not you consider yourself religious or spiritual. So we'll be talking about that. It'll be, a lot of what I do is interactive. It's going to feel kind of odd because people aren't going to be sitting in front of me, but I'll be encouraging people to do exercises while I'm speaking, as if we are sitting in the same place, because I would love for them to get the actual experience of that spiritual energy, that I guess you call it a transmission or a download. As someone who does the work that you do, you know what I'm talking about.
Right, absolutely.
So, and the word, one of my favorite words is enthusiasm, and it means God-infused. So my intention is that people will come away from those classes feeling God-infused, feeling as if they're swimming in the energy, swimming in the God pool.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, and I know that there is so much power, like we've already talked about during our time together, this conversation, just in being in community with other like-minded people who have an intention to, raise that voice up to their source, to that place of oneness, to connect to God and all that we understand that to be. Whether we call it God or whether we call it divine energy or Mother Earth or, Holy Source or I Am, like you talked about earlier, really, we're still having that same conversation where we connect to this deeper part within ourselves that brings in this richer tapestry to our lives.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled to be part of that, to be part of that tapestry, and we're all threads in that tapestry.
Absolutely. Edie Weinstein, I just want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Your book, The Bliss Mistress Guide to Transforming the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. Where can we find this book?
Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or BalboaPress.com. Balboa Press is a subsidiary of Hay House, and I publish it for that company. So, again, they are more than welcome to read it. They are more than welcome to share it, and I encourage everybody to be the master or mistress of their own bliss.
Wonderful. Edie, thank you so much, and to everyone else, thanks for being here with us tonight on Spirituality Bootcamp. It's been a real pleasure doing the series with all of you, and stay tuned to your email, and you'll get more instructions about our encore performance. Until then, have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather.